So this evening I'm going to start my version of Italian bread, and what you do approximately 8 to 10 hours before you're going to add other ingredients. You start something called the biga. Some people call it a poolish, some people call it a starter or a sponge. I call it biga. So for this biga, we start out with 1 teaspoon of yeast. And I just use the instant yeast. So that's 1 teaspoon of yeast. And then 1 1/8 cup of water. And then 2 cups of flour. And when you're measuring flour, you don't want to scoop directly into the packed flour. What I do is I scoop in, loosen it up, scoop in, loosen it up, and then go into the loosened flour and get 1 cup. And then I do the same thing. You loosen the flour, and then go in and scoop. And 2 cups. And then you set your machine to the dough cycle and start it. And you're only going to let it mix for a few minutes. We'll come back and I'll show you what it looks like after 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, actually it's only been maybe a couple minutes, and I want you to look inside here and see what the biga looks like when it's mixed. You really just want it mixed. It's going to be an amorphous blob. And when it looks about like this, just goopy, you simply turn off the machine. And you close it and walk away, and you come back anywhere from 8 to 12 hours later. You really don't want it, ideally around 10 hours. After 12, the yeast could be consumed and it could go sour. The other thing I forgot to mention, the flour that I use is a high gluten bread flour. You really don't want to use an all-purpose flour. You have to go for the bread flour if you want the texture. So I unplug the machine just so that it's off, and I'll be back in the morning to add the other ingredients, and we'll go from there. All right, here we are. This is the biga. This is after about 10.5 hours. And what I'm going to do initially is put the program to dough. Just press the button to deflate the biga, just so we have some room to add our other ingredients. And what the biga does is it gives the bread flavor and texture. So then you turn your machine off, and you're going to add the other ingredients. So the first thing I add is yeast, and I'm putting in 1.5 teaspoons of yeast. And then we add water, and this is 5/8 cup of water. And then I'm adding 1 teaspoon of sugar. And then I'm going to add the flour. I'm adding 1.5 cups of flour. And the very last thing that I add is the salt. You don't want your salt in direct contact with your yeast. And I'm adding 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Okay, and then I'm going to start the machine, and as you can see, it's going to be a very, very wet dough. We're going to come back in about 5 minutes or so. I want to show you the texture, because it's after about 5 or 10 minutes where you're going to be making any changes if you need to. If you have to add more flour because it's too wet, you'll add it a tablespoon at a time. If it's too dry, you'll add a tablespoon of water at a time. So we'll come back. You can see it's a nice wet dough. One other thing is in some machines where the pan is wide and rectangular, you might notice that there's flour or dough sticking on the sides. Usually that corrects itself if after 10-15 minutes it looks like it's not picking up all of the flour or dough. You can take a spatula and gently feed the leftover dough back into the dough ball. So we're going to close this, come back in about 5 or 10 minutes, and I'll show you the texture of what this should look like. And we're going to let this run on the dough cycle all the way till the end. There's no more touching any buttons. Okay. I'm going to show you what this looks like. Most bread machines, after the initial, this has been 6 minutes, after it initially mixes, it lets it rest, and that's when you want to check your texture. So if you can see in here, if you come on closely, it's pretty amorphous. It's not holding into a nice ball. It has a nice shine on it. If you touch it, it's very, very sticky. Very sticky. And that's how it should be. So if it looks like there's, see on the edges where it's actually sticking but coming up, if your dough is sitting flat like a river, then it's too wet. If it's dry, if it's got flour on the outside of it, then it's too dry. Even though you follow a recipe, everybody measures their flour differently. So anyway, this is what it should look like, kind of a mound, sticky, shiny, and we're ready to go. And then this machine in a few minutes will start working the dough again. So at this point, you're fine, and you let it go. But this is when you would want to be making any changes to your recipe. Okay, so we're going to come back in about an hour, and I'm going to show you what to do when your dough cycle has finished. Okay, I just want to show you, I wasn't going to show you, but I want to show you, it's working the dough now. And if you could come in closely, I want to show you what this should look like. So it looks like a nice, it's not quite, not amorphous anymore. It's made a nice ball, but it's still a shiny ball. And anyway, just wanted to show you what this looks like when what the ball should look like. All right. Okay, my machine has just beeped. This is after the first dough cycle, and it punched it down a little bit. And some of these machines don't punch it down at all, in which case, and I'm going to do it here too, if your machine at the end of the dough cycle doesn't punch it down, what you do is you set it again for, let's see, you take it back to the dough setting, push start, and just let it work it so that it'll bring it down a bit. You want it to pretty much pull it off the sides, as you can see here. And then just turn it off and close the lid, and then you're going to come back. I would come back and check it at about 45 minutes. This next process is variable. It can take anywhere from half hour to an hour, usually 45 minutes to an hour. What some people experience is that even after an hour, the dough might come up 3/4 of the way and then just stop. If after an hour your dough has only come up 3/4 of the way, just go ahead and go to the next step, which we'll show in an hour. Otherwise, you want it to rise just above the rim of your pan. The higher that it rises, the more volume you're going to have. What could cause it to not rise could be the water that you're using. If you have well water and you have a lot of pH neutralizers and water softeners and conditioners down in your basement, that can affect the water. If you're on city water and it's chlorinated, might have chemicals in it that would keep the dough from rising. If you find that your dough doesn't rise the way this dough will rise, we'll see in an hour, then you may want to switch to a distilled water or a bottled water. So we're just going to close the lid. I'm going to unplug it again because we're not going to have it do anything. The machine's not going to be doing anything. And we'll be back in about an hour to see if it has risen above the pan, and then we'll go from there. Okay, here we are after an hour, and as you can see, this has risen beautifully. I've let it rise above. You wouldn't want it to go anymore because when you close the door, you can see it's touching. So anyway, so at this point, what you do is you gently remove your pan and be very careful not to deflate your dough. I'm going to move the machine over here so I have some room to work. Let me. Okay, so you've got this beautiful dough here. What you want to do is you take a nice cutting board and you're going to work on the cutting board, and this is the board you're going to use to take the bread to the grill. So what you do is you rub some flour into it. You don't want too much flour, but you want enough that it shouldn't stick initially. So you rub that into your board, and then you take your dough and you tilt it. And we're going to let it come out by gravity. So you bring your blob out. You can shake it a little bit just to kind of loosen it up. Here it comes. You can see how wet it is. It's got lots of nice air bubbles. And in my pan, it came right out. So then, what you want to do, you've got to get a little bit more flour on your hands and just put it on the side. And we're going to gently move this around and coat it with flour. So I'm going to gently roll it over. You don't want to pinch it or anything. You want it to stay as inflated as possible. So gently roll it. You can see it's sticking a little bit here. And this is a chopper scraper. These are very handy for lifting it a little bit. And I'm going to flip it over the other way. There. Now it's loose. So you want it loose on the board. You don't want it sticking anywhere. And now is when you cut it into whatever shape you want. I'm going to make kind of baguettes. So you take your first cut, and the key here is to make all your pieces about the same size. And so now this part's dry, and I'm flipping it up, and this is the wet side from the inside, so I'm going to leave that up, and it's going to bake in that position. Now this side's where I've made a fresh cut is wet, so you want to rub some flour in there, tilt it so that now that side is not going to stick. Cut your second roll. This side's dry. This little strip here is wet. Same thing now, where you've made your fresh cut is wet. So tilt that a little bit. This cutter, this scraper chopper is very, very handy tool. I'm going to move these over a little bit, and when you move them, just gently pick them up. You don't want to be squeezing. And let's cut another one, and that'll be about it. So, oh, I forgot to dry that side, so I'm going to flip that over. Okay, so it doesn't stick, because when you go to transfer these onto the stone, you don't want anything sticking. And then this last one is dry on this side and wet at the new cut, so I'm just going to flip it up so that the cut is up. Okay, and then we're ready to take our bread out to the grill, and I turned on the grill, and when it reaches about 380, it's okay then to put it on the stone. So we'll take it out to the grill. Okay, so this grill's at about 380. I'm gonna lift it up, and this part is dangerous, so be careful. I'm gonna go ahead and lay these on with my hands. Just lay them on gently. Give a little bit of space between them. If they end up sticking together, it's no biggie. Okay, close the lid. And I usually set a timer for about 10 minutes. This bread usually takes around 15, anywhere from 15 to 20, but I like to check it at 10 to see, make sure we're not burning it. So we'll be back in about 10 minutes. All right, it's been about 15 minutes or so. And here we are. And you want to check and make sure that the bottom is nice and cooked. You can tap the top, listen. Should be nice and hollow. And I use tongs to remove the bread. Nice and brown. All right, and there you have it. Beautiful loaves of Italian bread ready to go. Let me just show you one more time. I want you to be able to hear the sound. You can come in closely. Should sound very hollow. Not squishy. Nice and crisp. All right. So there we are, you've got it. My version of Italian bread. As far as I'm concerned, this is the best bread you can put in your mouth. All right, thank you.